y'all, this is Miss McDowell here, doing your next lesson on the Civil War. We're going to talk about a little bit about what happened after the battles. We're going to kind of go back and forth a little bit in time, just to make some more sense of what the Underground Railroad is and what the end of the Civil War, how the end of the Civil War impacted slavery. We'll get more into Reconstruction in the next week. So just make sure, again, these are tough topics to have, tough conversations to have, because we will be talking a lot about slavery, but just know that your teacher, or any fifth grade teacher, is here to discuss these tough topics and conversations with you. So if you have any questions or things you need clarification on, please do not hesitate to reach out. So in beginning with the end in mind, our goal for today's lesson is to read informational text about the United States after the Civil War, and also read a historical fiction text about the Underground Railroad. And we are doing this so that we can understand the effects of this, of the Civil War on the United States in the years following, and then also better understand how individuals were impacted by slavery, and ultimately their journey to freedom. This is your message to, during these slides, stop, do not pass go, do not collect $200. If you have not read the article or excerpts of the article that I posted, or listened to me read the excerpts of the article, or listened to the reading of Henry's Freedom Box. So that's step 1 and step 2 on your social studies virtual learning document. So make sure, if you haven't done that, you're pausing this video right here and you're going back and doing that, because we're going to be discussing those article excerpts or little bits of that article. And then we're also going to be discussing Henry's Freedom Box. So make sure that you have done that before you continue on in this screencast. Okay, so what did we learn from the excerpts of the North and the South article? What did we want you to gain from reading those little bits of that article is there were many people working against slavery before the Civil War. So before the Civil War happened and ended, there were many people that wanted slavery to end. And then we also learned that those people were called abolitionists. They were people who worked to help free slaves. We also learned, in case you missed it in one of the previous lessons, emancipation or emancipate means to set free. So when you are seeking emancipation, you want to be set free of some sort of bounds you're being held in. A lot of times we hear it in reference to slavery. After the Civil War, Lincoln did not want to punish the southern states and actually wanted the country to just become one again. And so that's kind of an interesting idea, because you would think, hey, these states left our country, we need to punish them in some type of way to teach them a lesson. However, Abraham Lincoln really just wanted the country to be a United States, and so did not feel punishing them was the best way to go. The amendments, or certain amendments, were added to the Constitution to reflect new rights. So because of the end of the Civil War, and because of everything that was going on in the country, remember, amendments are changes. And so there were some changes added to our Constitution to reflect the new rights of certain people. And then as Reconstruction ended due to the structure of the Southern states government, many of the rights freed slaves earned after the Civil War were taken or kind of used against them. And so there was a lot of building up with this Reconstruction rebuilding of our country, which we'll talk about in other lessons later on a little bit more. But with that, there's always like an end to that time period. And so with that end to that time period, or the end to Reconstruction, a lot of Southern states actually gained a lot of their rights back that they were initially kind of stripped of, or kind of closely monitored at. And so ultimately, because of that, a lot of slaves ended up losing those rights, or those kind of gains that they were given at the end of the Civil War. I always forget my little arrow doesn't work. Okay, so Henry's Freedom Box. You should have listened to this be read If you were in my class, you might have heard a similar story at the beginning of the year, or I know some other classes, When Words Set Me Free, that told another story kind of similar to this one. But ultimately, if you read it, this is kind of what we wanted you to gain from it. It is about the story of a slave and his kind of transition throughout his life, and how ultimately he decides that he is not being treated correctly, and that he wants to be free. And so he ultimately packs himself in a box and mails himself to a place in the country that is free. So the inferences we wanted you to make from this particular text was that, or the knowledge that we kind of wanted you to gain was that slaves often don't know their birthdays, and so they unfortunately, they were individuals that weren't always necessarily cared for or cared about in the proper ways. And so part of that is not knowing like who they are a lot of times, and a lot of facts about their history with their birthdays. And then people didn't want slaves to learn how to read. So it was actually illegal in a lot of places to teach slaves the alphabet, or to teach slaves how to read and write. And so this comes from the idea that knowledge is power, and we still know that today. That's why we want y'all to go to school and learn as much as you can, is because knowledge gives you a lot of power. And so ultimately, in Henry's Freedom Box, you'll remember that um, his owner, or his owner's wife, was teaching him the alphabet and how and the sound letters. And this is what ultimately, even though she stopped doing that, this is what ultimately gave him the knowledge and the power to say, hey, I need more than this, and I want more than this. So a lot of places it was illegal to teach slaves how to read, because that sense of knowledge is very powerful. Families were often separated for the benefit of the people that owned them. So just because you were a family or a family unit did not mean that you would get to stay together. If it benefited, I'm sorry, excuse me, if it benefited the owner, ultimately, whole families of slaves could be separated. And then slaves would go to great lengths to become free, and as well as former slaves would go to great lengths to also help other slaves become free later on. So we're going to talk a little bit more about Henry's Freedom Box. This is not something that you got the opportunity to hear in the read aloud, and I don't have my copy of the book, so Miss O'Brien actually ended up finding the copy of the author's note for me. So an author's note, just before we talk about it, it gives the author the opportunity to directly address the reader. So a lot of times in these fiction stories, authors don't get the opportunity to say exactly what they're thinking, because they're telling a story. And so in an author's note, they can directly address the reader and explain a little bit more about what they wrote and why they wrote it. And then in nonfiction text, an author's note can give additional information about the topic. So a lot of times, if they need to give some background knowledge or some more information about why they wrote it, it does that. I know in Words Set You Free, it actually gives some insight as to why the author actually wrote the book, which I always find interesting as to if they have a personal connection to writing the book. So this is a picture of Ellen Levine, and we're going to actually read her author's note from Henry's Freedom Box. So this is the note she wrote at the end of the text. In the mid-1800s, there were about 4 million slaves living in the United States. Slaves were owned like tables or cows or wagons. Historians believe between 60,000 and 100,000 slaves escaped to freedom, traveling on what was called the Underground Railroad. The Underground Railroad wasn't a real railroad. It was all the secret ways slaves made their way from the South to the North. They hid in carts, rode on horseback, walked hundreds of miles through forests and swamps, and crossed flowing rivers in summer and ice-bound rivers in winter. Conductors and station masters hid them and helped them throughout their journey. When Henry Brown climbed into his freedom box, he hoped he'd be carried to a safe world. He brought along a small tool to make air holes, a little water, and a few biscuits. He arrived in Philadelphia, having traveled 350 miles from Richmond, Virginia, in 27 hours. His story made newspaper headlines in America and Europe. Henry never found Nancy and his children. In 1850, he went to England, and there are some reports that he married again. We do not know with absolute certainty that Henry Box, and remember that's the middle name he got, Brown, became one of the most famous runaway slaves. Or we do know with absolute certainty, that Henry Box Brown became one of the most famous runaway slaves on the Underground Railroad. The man who mailed himself to freedom. Okay, so now we're going to talk a little bit more about what exactly that author's note tells us. And so that author's note provided us data on the amount of escaped slaves. It also let us know that the Underground Railroad was not an actual railroad. So I remember learning about this specifically in second or third grade. We touched a little bit on this topic. And I remember thinking, wow, they built this whole like tunnel system, like a subway, underneath the ground. And no, it's not actually a railroad. It's just they're using that term in terms of like a path for which people travel. Okay. And then we also learned how long and for how long and how far Henry traveled. We learned that he never found his wife. And then we also learned that one of the most famous slaves of the Underground Railroad in his history was told in newspapers. So kind of how did Henry get famous? But I touch on this author's note because it shows you the importance of the Underground Railroad and how Henry Box Brown is actually considered a person who traveled on the Underground Railroad, even though he didn't necessarily travel a path that is well known or a path that other people followed, because he did something so unique. So just to put it into perspective, the dimensions of Henry's box were super, super tiny. Normally, when we read this text in the classroom, I would do a little box on the floor for you and tape, and then allow you to try to like sit in it comfortably. So I would encourage, if you have tape or something at home, to do that, just to kind of get into perspective how small this was. So it was a 3 foot by 2 foot by 2 foot 8 inches box. So really, very, very small that he had to fit into. Not quite as comfortable looking as this one. Not that any box is comfortable, but not quite as big as this one is like shown here. It was probably even a bit smaller than that. Okay, so what was the Underground Railroad? So to be more specific, the Underground Railroad was a network of secret routes and safe houses established in the United States during the early to mid 19th century, and it was used by enslaved African Americans to escape into free states in Canada. The scheme or the kind of concept of it was assisted by abolitionists and others sympathetic to the cause of escapees. And so the Underground Railroad was really just their series of networks that they traveled to get free. And we're going to go through a little bit more of it. So again, networks, paths, system of networks, however you want to phrase it, still just a path that many people followed to become free. And so it was for runaway slaves to escape to the north. And while you may think of it as an actual railroad, it was just it's called kind of a railroad because it had all these stops along the way. And instead of them being stops like on an actual like train path, they're just safe houses. And they created this group of people that really wanted to help out slaves and help get them free. A lot of times the safe houses were known as depots. They're different than the depots we talked about in Civil War, but kind of or in the Civil War battles. But kind of the same concept, because depots allowed these people to have safe places to stay and rest and gain supplies and food that they needed along their journey, the same way the depot in the Civil War provided soldiers with a place to kind of gain supplies and needed materials. And the people either owned the home or worked in a church, and they were called station masters. And we learned from Henry's Freedom Box. And then safe houses were often thought of as being only homes of white abolitionists, but they were also home of former slaves and churches of people from different religions, but the Quaker religion, and sometimes just regular old farmers would have a spot on the Underground Railroad. Or be a station master on the Underground Railroad. we have a very famous abolitionist pictured off to the side in these slides here, Harriet Tubman. I was the conductor of the Underground Railroad for 8 years. I can say with what most conductors can't say. I never ran my train off track, and I never lost a passenger. So she's using a metaphor there to talk about how she never lost a single person that she helped transport to safety, which is pretty amazing. All right, so some more terms that we need to cover for the Underground Railroad are station masters. We touched on that just a little bit, but they hid runaway slaves in their homes or stations, like we touched on before. Conductors were people that actually guided and transported them to the next station. So those were different. Station masters welcomed people into their homes or where they were staying, whereas conductors actually transported them to the next station. And then stockholders couldn't necessarily conduct, and they couldn't necessarily be a station master, but they did give food, money, or clothing to these fugitive slaves as they needed it. And then, as we touched on before, abolitionists were someone who wanted to end slavery, especially in the United States and the Civil War. And then passengers sometimes were referred to as the baggage, and they were what slaves were called. So passengers or baggage might be what you hear slaves on the Underground Railroad referred to as. Okay. So here, we are going to talk about the Fugitive Slave Act. This is what I was talking about, where we're kind of going like back and forth in time to before the Civil War and after the Civil War. But the Fugitive Slave Act was actually passed in 1793. Ultimately, what it said was that it was later amended right before the Civil War in 1850, but it ultimately were the laws that gave the government the power to capture and return runaway slaves. And so basically before the Civil War and in this long stretch of time period, if a slave did escape through the Underground Railroad or through help from an abolitionist and they got to freedom, if they were found and it was determined that they were them, they were ultimately returned. And that was a legal thing to do, was to capture and return them. And a lot of times there was a lot of reward or money provided when they were returned. So unfortunately, there was a lot of incentive or like reasons for people to do this and participate in doing this. So even when they ultimately reached freedom, a lot of times slaves were not feeling as if they were free because of this law. You have to remember that at this time period, as difficult as this is to talk about, unfortunately, in American history, slaves are considered property. So they have a monetary, meaning money value to them. And so if they run away to the people that own them at the time, it feels like they're losing money. And so that's why to them it was important to get them back. And that Fugitive Slave Act, unfortunately, helped people to be able to do that. Eventually, even though this wasn't necessarily one of the direct causes of the Civil War, it did help to fuel the flames for the Civil War to fight to begin. And instead of uniting America the way they wanted it to unite America and say, hey, we're going to allow this to be a law, ultimately it kind of separated America. And so in 1864, at the conclusion of the Civil War, both acts were repealed, meaning both acts were taken away, gotten rid of, and and this was because of the growing number of abolitionists and people that opposed them, and the end of the Civil War. Okay, so we're going to review a little bit about who Abraham Lincoln was, when he got elected, things like that, how his presidency led to the Civil War, and then we're going to talk about the Emancipation Proclamation. So Lincoln won the 1860 election, which we talked about in former lessons, and was inaugurated as president in March of 1861. The Southern states did not want Lincoln to be president. They did not agree with his policies. Before he was officially in office, they began to secede. So we talked about this. Secede means to leave or remove yourself from a certain body or group that you don't agree with anymore. So those Southern states began to secede and remove themselves. And then the first state, we've talked about this, was South Carolina. And then soon 6 more joined. And then ultimately after Fort Sumter, more joined. and they formed the Confederacy, which we talked about last time. This all happened after Lincoln won the election, but before he took the oath of office. So that is pretty interesting to think about, is that he wasn't even president yet when the parts of the country were deciding to do this. They just knew that he was going to become president. And then on January 1st, 1863, Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation, which we referenced when we talked about Civil War battles. And this was an order that freed the slaves in the Confederate States. And although not all the slaves were immediately set free, it paved the way for the 13th Amendment, which would free all slaves in the United States a few years later. So you're probably thinking, hey, he's president. He decided that the Emancipation Proclamation was what is going to free all the slaves. But ultimately, you'll notice that it's 1863 and the Civil War doesn't end, unfortunately, until 1864. And so to the Confederate States, Lincoln doesn't actually have any control over them. So him saying that it's ending does not actually mean anything to them. So we are going to talk now about the Emancipation Proclamation and kind of what happens here and why it doesn't necessarily go into effect the way that we would assume it would. So it happened January 1st, 1863. All slaves were not immediately freed. About 50,000 of the 4 million slaves were set free immediately following the order. Okay, and then why? You might be saying, why weren't all slaves immediately set free? So it only freed the slaves in Confederate states that were not under like Union control. And so if they were under Union control, those slaves were not necessarily free yet. There were some areas in border states where slavery was still legal, but they were a part of the Union. These slaves were also, slaves in these states were also not immediately freed. Unfortunately, it was probably to kind of keep those states as part of the Union, as like a bargaining tool. And then for the rest of the southern states, the slaves would not be free until the Union was able to defeat the Confederacy. So the Union hadn't defeated the Confederacy when this went into effect, and so they couldn't necessarily ultimately say that all of these slaves are free when that was not when they didn't have control of that area yet. And then what else did it do? It eventually set millions of slaves free. And then we talked a little bit about how some freed African Americans or freed Black men actually fought in the Union Army. And so it ultimately, the Emancipation Proclamation was what allowed that to happen. And about 200,000, fought in the Union Army to ultimately end slavery. All right, so what's coming next? So we've are going to continue to talk a little bit more about the Underground Railroad and some specific leaders of the Underground Railroad. With that, we will move into what Reconstruction actually is and leaders in Reconstruction of the United States, which just means like the rebuilding. And then we'll also talk about amendments that were impacted throughout this, or amendments that kind of came out of the Civil War happening. And then we will close out this unit with the impact of the Civil War on women and children. So we talk a lot about men when we're thinking about the Civil War and what's happening in our country at this time. But there's a whole population that we're not referencing, which is women and children who were definitely impacted by the Civil War. So we will talk about that in the coming lessons. Please let us know if you have any questions or if any of these topics are things you would like to further discuss with your teacher.